Good morning or good evening, depending on from where you're joining us around the world, and welcome to this Chatham House webinar as part of the Asia Pacific programme. I'm Edward Howell, the Career Foundation Fellow at Chatham House and also a lecturer in politics at Oxford University. It's my great privilege and pleasure to chair today's event on trilateral cooperation between the United States, South Korea and Japan in an age of regional and global crises. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Career Foundation and to thank you, the audience, for joining us today. A few housekeeping notices just before we start. The webinar will be held on the record, so not under the Chatham House rule. We'll be recording the proceedings and the webinar will be distributed and disseminated online afterwards. We very much hope that you will have a wealth of questions to ask during this event, so we encourage you please to do so via the Q&A function on the screen and not using the hand raise or the chat function. This event couldn't come at a timelier moment in Northeast Asia. It's a particularly tense time on the Korean Peninsula as North Korea accelerates its pursuit of conventional as well as nuclear and missile capabilities, having tested new hypersonic missile technology only last week. As the Biden administration in Washington enters the final months of its first term in office, any negotiations with North Korea now look rather unlikely. And in South Korea, the administration of South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has faced ongoing domestic challenges of an emboldened North Korea, as well as maintaining its relations with China. And only yesterday, South Korea launched a spy satellite as part of a push to improve monitoring North Korea. Indeed, tomorrow we'll see highly significant legislative elections taking place in South Korea, but also in Japan, which all too frequently witnesses North Korean missiles landing in territorial waters. This is a significant moment for Japan since we've seen a sudden outreach from Japanese Prime Minister Kishida to North Korean leader Kim Jong Un, which North Korea has perhaps expectedly rebuffed. And importantly, Kishida has recently arrived in the US for a state visit and talked with Biden tomorrow. There are, of course, many other questions, not least the possibility of Donald Trump winning the US presidential election in November and the implications this might bring for regional cooperation. So to help us unpack these issues, we're very lucky to have three extremely distinguished speakers to shed light on different perspectives on the topic of trilateral cooperation. So let me introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. Joining us from Tokyo, we have Professor Ken Endo, Chair and Professor of International Politics at the University of Tokyo and Adjunct Fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs. He is engaged extensively in Track 1.5 dialogue on Japan-Korea policy with the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has published extensively on questions of global governance, Japan-Europe relations, Japanese security, and Japan-South Korea ties. Next is Dr. Chungmin Lee, Senior Fellow in the Asia Programme at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Dr. Lee is a council member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and has extensive experience working in the government of South Korea, having served as Ambassador for International Security Affairs and as Ambassador for South Korea's National Security Affairs. His extensive work has concerned the security of Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula, particularly in terms of defence planning, military strategies, and domestic political trends. Finally, Ambassador Shin-Hwa Lee, currently South Korea's Ambassador for International Cooperation on North Korean Human Rights and a Professor of Political Science at Korea University. She's previously served as a visiting professor at Columbia University and a visiting scholar at Princeton, and her research concerns multilateral approaches to security, South Korea's multilateral diplomacy, human security, as well as South Korea's middle power strategy. We're most grateful to our three speakers today for their participation. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Endo, who will speak for between 3 to 5 minutes to start our discussion with some opening remarks.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Edward. I'm quite honored to join the team of distinguished speakers at such a timely event coinciding the state visit of Prime Minister Kishida to the United States, as well as at the general elections in South Korea. And as far as the trilateral relations, in my view, is concerned, the two factors, the US-China hegemonic competitions and the Ukrainian war, have resulted in changes in three dimensions. One on Korean Peninsula, another Japan-Korea bilateral relations, and the Taiwan situations. But let me begin with the Korean Peninsula. In my view, the situation on the peninsula has undergone rapid changes. The framework of cooperation that was symbolized by the six-party talk has long been dead, replaced by the sort of block-like constellation, on the one hand of Japan, United States, and South Korea, and on the other, the China, Russia, North Korea. And in addition to the North Korea's military expansion that Edward has just mentioned, the both qualitative and quantitative, China and Russia have shifted their position closer to North Korea, especially within the framework of United Nations Security Council. And China-North Korea trade may have started to resume. And also the sort of military cooperation between Russia and North Korea has progressed. All of these cause some concerns on our side. And amid such circumstances, separated by the 38th parallel, North Korea has sort of recognized South Korea as a state, while still regarding it with hostility. It may take some time to determine what this signifies, but while North Korea might possibly think it could do anything, including harmful to South Korea. But it may lead to the situation where these two states might coincide, coexist with some hostility. Now, there's many things are going on this peninsula. And second, the bilateral relationship between South Korea and Japan have improved so much under the President Yoon. Mainly thanks to his leadership, but also to which Japan has responded, producing policy content logical policy content logical from the perspective of our security. The immediate information sharing related to the missile launching have started. And joint exercises are being conducted by our navies and air forces among the three powers. The military closeness between these three powers is indispensable in trying to check North Korea's ambition. And third is the Taiwan situation. Here, medium to long-term preparation may be needed. And the result of Taiwan's presidential election means that there is only mago possibility for the peaceful unification between the two sides. But Mr. Xi Jinping, may have some obsession about Taiwan derived from his career. He's deepening his dictatorship, and he has a limited lifespan, which may produce any irrational decision akin to the decision of Mr. Putin in invading his neighboring country. So we may not be able to lower our guard, especially because China doesn't change its position, in trying to change the status quo over the Taiwan Strait, and it has increasing capacity to change that status quo, coupled with the deepening dictatorship. So we may have to prepare for some Taiwan contingency, although I would reckon that there wouldn't be any full-scale invasion, but there are many other scenarios like missile launching, blockade, cyber attacks, and so on, to which we may have to be prepared from now on. I stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much, Professor Endo. A real broad array of points raised, which I'm sure we'll all want to come to later on in the discussion, particularly in terms of bilateral relations between Japan and the ROK, but also the issue of Taiwan. Let's now move over to Seoul and to Dr. Chung-Min Lee. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Edward, and to my colleagues, both in Tokyo and in London. It's a real pleasure to join Chatham House and to all our, listeners and viewers overseas. In the interest of time, I am going to make my intro remarks quite short. I think there are three key points that I wanted to share with the audience. And the first is I agree with Professor Ken Endo that trilateral ties have never been better in my memory. That's the good news. The bad news is that this trilateral cooperation depends heavily on domestic politics in South Korea, in Japan, less so, but also in the US. And tomorrow on April 10th, as you alluded to, Edward, we have crucial National Assembly elections here in South Korea. In Korea, it is against the law to publish survey results about 5 days before the election, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But almost all of the indicators show that the opposition, which currently holds a majority in the National Assembly, will perhaps become a winner again. And so if you look at the polls over the last, I'd say 3 months, it's been quite depressing from the conservative point of view. And one of the really critical issues is that although President Yoon has really made an effort to improve ties with the US and especially with Japan, which I think Ambassador Shin Lee and I totally support, the problem is his popularity is only at about 35 to 40%. And so, although I dare not predict exactly what the result will be in tomorrow's election, I think it will be very difficult for the conservatives and the ruling party to do very well. Who knows, they might surprise us, but I don't think that's the case. If that's the case, however, then President Yoon will be under huge domestic pressure. And the key is he has 3 years left in his term. In other words, how are you going to basically become an effective leader when you no longer control the National Assembly and the opposition has just won, if they do, a major victory tomorrow? That means, I think, politically, President Yoon will begin to face a lot of pressure from his own party and for those who also want to succeed him as president in the May 2027 presidential election. So I think what's going to happen in Korea politically is that the race for the presidency is going to accelerate both within the ruling party and the opposition. The second political variable, of course, is what's going to happen in the US. Again, we don't know whether Biden is going to win or Trump will re-enter the White House. If Trump goes back into power, however, there will be huge changes in US-ROK and US-Japan relations. He may want to do a nuclear deal with Kim Jong Un because he failed in 2018 and 2019. But regardless of what Trump does, or even if Mr. Biden is reelected, I think the American posture in Northeast Asia, in many respects, is becoming weaker. Not just because of China's rise, for example, but because there's a growing, concern within the US political landscape that you don't really want to support critical allies, whether it's in Europe or in Asia. And my final point is bilateral Korean-Japanese ties are really good at this moment, but they also hinge on domestic politics. And I believe that if the opposition party does well tomorrow, then they will also attack President Yoon's rapprochement with Japan. I think that's a wrong decision, and that's something that we should not support. But politically, it makes sense from the opposition side to always ramp up anti-Japanese sentiment. And of course, the far right in Japan does the same thing. But all I'm saying is that it hinges much more on domestic politics. So I hope that in closing, in my initial remarks, that politics will not dominate foreign policy. And I think my final word is, we'll go back to this, I think North Korea is hollowing out as we speak. And so I have a piece coming out at the Carnegie Endowment fairly soon, but I believe that Kim Jong Un really has failed as a leader. And that, I think, will have major repercussions that I'm sure Xinhua will be able to add more light on. But thank you for inviting me and to sharing this great, space with my two great colleagues, three, including Edward, of course.
Thank you very much, Chang-min, and thank you for highlighting the crucial issue of domestic politics, not least in South Korea, but also in Japan, the US, and North Korea. I'm sure we'll come back to this question and what difference this makes in terms of South Korea's approach towards its allies, but perhaps also its adversaries. So we'll now hand over to Ambassador Xinhua Lee for her remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for Ken Endo-sang and Lee Jung-min 교수님 for wonderful initial remark. So I would like to add also 3 short points in relation to those trilateral cooperation. The first is kind of hopes and challenges in this trilateral cooperation. The August last year Camp David summit was crucial for US, Japan, South Korea solidifying and formalizing our alliance through the adoption of threefold mechanism, comprising Camp David spirit and principle and commitment to ongoing dialogue. So this was essential, at least against at least the 2 backdrops. The first, the necessity of the institutionalizing the trilateral cooperation to prevent at least a fluctuation in cooperation due to the ups and downs of bilateral relations, particularly between the Korea and Japan. And the second is, as Professor Lee Jung-min also briefly mentioned in a way, potential shift in US and South Korea's national interest and the policy priority, especially those influenced by electoral outcomes. So the recalibration of alliance, particularly the US strategy to counter China, is exemplified by the Chip 4 alliance, right? And those alliance extends beyond military cooperations to critical economic and technology areas like semiconductor supply chain security. So that indicates that the US alliance is not only military basis, but for interest basis, including economy and other issues. And Japan is increasingly focused on maritime security due to threats from North Korea and China, while South Korea remains concentrated on North Korea's nuclear capability. So those differing priority among those 3 countries highlight the complexity of sustaining effective trilateral cooperation. And tomorrow is a very significant development, as I expected, with the US-Japan summit in Washington time and South Korea's legislative elections in Korea time. The summit might result in Japan enhancing its military capability, indicating a move towards a more assertive and normal state. But this change could, however, complicate relations with South Korea, particularly if South Korean political groups critical of Japan's military expansion gain power tomorrow. Simultaneously, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida is open to high-level discussion with North Korea, and he confessed, he said with the CNN interview, right? And this decision influenced by various factors, including domestic politics. But I think it is very important that these talks align with the trilateral alliance goals to maintain regional security and the unity of the alliance. Well, in that sense, I'm glad the Endo-san is mentioned. I'm glad that he acknowledged the improvement of our relations thanks to the President Yoon's initiative. And also, I would like to remind you the next year marks the 60th anniversary of our bilateral relations between, and you remember the commemoration of both the 40th and 50th anniversary passed with a minimal celebration due to our terrible relations. So to maintain the momentum of cooperation between our two countries, it is hoped that the Prime Minister Kishida make it sure closer coordination with the South Korean government when he's dealing with the North Korea. And the outcome of the South Korean election, as Professor Lee Jong-min has mentioned, is, I think, very important. If parties favoring a US-China balance win decisively, that's what his prediction, it could weaken the current government's policy. This outcome may impact the US-South Korea and Japan-South Korea alliance and alter the broader trilateral relationship, highlighting the complexity of maintaining stable alliance in a changing geopolitical landscape that can be further aggravated if Trump comes back. Second point is Russia's UN veto, North Korea sanctions panel I would like to mention. Russia veto last March 28th against extending the UN North Korea Sanction Committee's expert panel mandate that represent a critical shift in global diplomacy, significantly undermining the UN Security Council sanction on North Korea. This complicates trilateral effort among the US, Japan, and South Korea, particularly as South Korea rejoined the Security Council after 11 years and fosters hopes for stronger collaboration on North Korea's denuclearization and other security concerns. North Korea's growing ties with Russia, evidently in its support for Russia in the Ukraine conflict, suggest a trend towards easing, the relieving sanctions, the shifting focus from denuclearizations to controlling its nuclear proliferation and military links with Russia. There's uncertainty definitely about the US future approach to North Korea, particularly if Trump returns to power, potentially impacting initiatives like the Nuclear Consultative Group, NCG, and the Washington Declaration, what we made with Biden last year. China's abstention in the Security Council vote with Russia vetoing has drawn criticism as well. China seeks to balance its global leadership goals with its ties to Russia and North Korea, avoiding overt military cooperation to preserve its global image. But I think that's very coward decision, because the prospect of North Korea having a nuclear arsenal by 2030 comparable to the UK or France as a strategic and diplomatic challenges, particularly for China in navigating this complex situation. Actually, I had my literature book just come out. I did the volume. I was mentioning about this issue, but in interest time, I'll just skip for now. Last one is North Korea human rights and nuclear risk as a two sides of the same coin. I will be very brief for this one now. As a North Korean human rights ambassador and international security scholar myself, I have been emphasizing the direct connection between North Korea's human rights violation and its nuclear program. These elements are key to Kim Jong Un's strategy for maintaining regime security. Externally, he used military provocation and adventurism to assert North Korea's nuclear status and focuses on disarmament rather than genuine denuclearization in talks with the US. Domestically, Kim Jong Un strictly prohibit information inflow from outside and punish for watching or using South Korean drama, songs, and language style, and employ severe methods like political prison camp and public execution to control control its people. The human rights and security nexus is evident in situations like the diversion of scarce food and resource to missile and nuclear programs. Forced labor of citizens in this project, exploitation of overseas workers for funding, and radiation risk to workers and residents near nuclear sites like Yongbyon and Punggye-ri. However, international community, including US and Japan and the previous Korean government, the prior emphasis on nuclear negotiation and diplomatic relation with North Korea, while neglecting human rights, has inadvertently allowed the regime to bolster its nuclear capability. And there's no record to improve the inter-Korean and US-North Korean relations by engaging with North Korea at that time either. So this approach has been a substantial policy failure, further empowering and emboldening the Kim regime. Therefore, I hope the Korea and US and Japan, we should solidifying our collective wisdom and the collective cooperations to address the North Korean questions, both the military and the human rights issues.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lee. An excellent broader range of points raised, particularly drawing on the interplay and interaction between the human rights issue and the North Korean nuclear issue. I'd just like to start with a question, if I may. All three of you have highlighted the strengthening relationship between Russia and North Korea. And we've often perhaps alluded to this idea of a strategic triangle between Russia, China, and North Korea. How concerned should we be? Is it all about simply money, that North Korea will give ammunition to Russia and Russia will give North Korea cash and maybe some satellite technology? Or is this actually a broader strategic triangle that is emerging that really poses a big challenge for trilateral cooperation in Northeast Asia?
If I can briefly reply to it, since I already mentioned it, although China tried to maintain the friendly relationship with Russia and North Korea, that's what we call continental power versus maritime power, right? But China tried to having a certain distance from what we can call fruit state, or states who are criticized for their own bad behaviors. Number one, because they still want to aspire to become a G2 as a global leader, so that they want to behave themselves so that they can having their image as a global leader. And number two, I think their domestic economic situation is pretty bad, so that I think they still want to have an opportunity and rationale to do something with the US, although the conflicting situation is still there. And then third is, as I mentioned, overt military cooperation with Russia and North Korea. I think there's a more losing game than winning games for China, because for them still the regional security is more beneficial for the further development of the country.
So no, some very interesting points. Thank you. Ken, you wanted to jump in there.
Sure. I wouldn't characterize this trilateral relations between Russia, North Korea, and China as a camp. It's not an established bloc. They have their own differences, sensitivities, and as far as at the moment, the Russian and North Korea's relations are like exchange between munitions and oil, and perhaps plus some space or missile technologies. And China is a bit nervous about this rapprochement between the sort of Moscow and Pyongyang. But at the same time, I would be to some extent alerted because about the status of North Korea as a nuclear armed country. I think China and especially Russia have more or less moved to recognize de facto, as a nuclear country, and within the framework of United Nations Security Council, they cooperate. Resulting in the sort of tacit recognition of that country's status as a nuclear powered. Now, I think the bottom line is that in running counter to the United States, these three countries have common interests, and it's not completely overlapped, but they are overlapped. So that's where we have to be careful about.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of points. I think one reason why Kim Jong Un is tilting towards Russia is because he is too dependent upon the Chinese. The PRC gives the North Koreans 90% of their fuel and oil. They also give them critical food supplies. So Kim Jong Un wants to lessen his dependence on China, and the Ukrainian war, from his perspective, was a godsend because Putin is able to provide North Korea with energy, with oil, with food, but most importantly, spare parts for his MiG-29 jets. And so the Russians, according to press reports, are in the midst of upgrading North Korean combat fighters that are really, really, really old. So if all that happens, this is a big boon for Kim Jong-un. The second point is I agree with Professor Endo that this is not a new alliance, but it is a very different Eurasia. For the first time since the Cold War, you have Eurasia that is united against the West. You have Russia, you have Iran, you have China, and North Korea. So you have this huge land-based anti-Western alignment versus the world's leading maritime powers, i.e. the US, Japan, and Korea. And so how we are able to counterbalance this new Eurasian threat is something that will concern all three of our countries as well as NATO, because if you look at the map, NATO counterbalances this Eurasia on the European continent, and the Japanese and the Koreans and the Americans counterbalanced Eurasia from this end of the Eurasian landmass. So this is why NATO and the Asian allies must cooperate. My final point is that, Kim Jong-un is trying to act like his grandfather. If you recall, Kim Il-sung used to play Pyongyang against Moscow and vice versa. Well, he is doing the same thing, not only physically trying to emulate his grandfather, but trying to become a leveraged, player in the Sino-Russian game. But in the end, Kim Jong-un has no choice but to go back to China. He simply cannot ignore his master in Beijing. And so therefore, regardless of the spurt in Russo-North Korean cooperation, I would argue that Kim Jong-un simply does not have the wherewithal to lessen his ties and dependence upon the Chinese.
And there's some very interesting points there, particularly in terms of the relationship with China. This leads us to a question that has come in from Matthew Kennedy. He asks, how do you see an improvement in Seoul-Tokyo ties as influencing China's policies towards North Korea, but also the broader Korean Peninsula? And linked to that is a question perhaps focusing more on the relationship with the US from Ben Bland. And Ben asks, do you think Kishida and Yoon are putting too many eggs in the American basket, given the maturation of US power and America's mounting problems at home?
Get this quickly?
Yes, go on, Chongmin, over to you.
Well, I think China-North Korea ties is a league on its own. And so I would argue that regardless of how close the Koreans are with the Japanese or vice versa, of course, it doesn't make the Chinese very happy that we're close. However, I think the China-North Korea relationship, whether it's on the nuclear issue, on strategic interests, on the fact that it serves as a buffer against South Korea, Japan, and the US, etc., the Chinese-North Korea relationship, in many respects, Kim Jong-un probably dislikes China more than he likes the US because he is so dependent upon the Chinese. But I think regardless of what happens between Seoul and Tokyo, the Pyongyang-Beijing relationship will continue. My second point is, Shinhwa mentioned earlier the importance of technology cooperation between our three countries. We're also competitors. Japanese, Korean, and American companies are always competing. But in this new era, a strategic technological realignment led by the US and with Japan and Korea, that's something that you cannot break for our own interests. And so I think in that sense, because these big tech giants are at the forefront of this technology war, this will basically strengthen trilateral cooperation going down the road.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Very interesting points. Ken, over to you.
May I join? Right. Definitely, as Ambassador said, the China always trying to keep the tie with Pyongyang, trying to maintain the sphere of interest, I think, in the peninsula. But at the same time, wouldn't like to see the closer relationship between Seoul and Tokyo, and trying to find every opportunity to wreck these bilateral relations, not just bilateral relationship, but any, the whole amongst this trilateral relationship. And as far as the United States is concerned, US is a global power. Obviously has many concerns all in every corner of the world these days, especially with Gaza and Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that the Washington DC would forget about Tokyo and Seoul. I think precisely because they are the global power, they reckon Japan and South Korea to try to sort of make best of this trilateral relationship for their national interests. So I don't think that it's sort of zero-sum between their concerns and the interest in this region.
Ambassador Lee, any
Yes.
points to add?
When it comes to Korea and Japan's ties toward China's policy, I think there are definitely some difference, as you see in its respective Indo-Pacific strategies. As we carefully look at the content of each government's the report, while Japan was very clear about countering or containing China aligned with the US, while the South Korea adopted almost all spirit and content from the US in the Indo-Pacific strategies. But one clear difference was we try to avoid provoke the China without just mentioning the China as the person who has to be the entity to deter. So I think that's the big difference. So therefore, either Kishida Yoon or any political leader of the both government, I think somehow have to sit down and to think about how we can deal with the China, not only in the bilateral setting, which might be sensitive, but how we can deal with it in the broader multilateral or unilateral settings. So in that case, I think China and Japan and Korea, before we are discussing with the United States, we have to think about what we should do. And I think this year and then next year will be the wonderful opportunity for us to discuss about it, because as we are celebrating the 60th anniversary this year, there are several different strategic meetings and also government or non-governmental the projects are going on to making a joint the report. And there, I hope that we too can having a more concrete and clearer strategies or menus for cooperation there. That definitely have to include our policy together toward China. And briefly about the China, the Japan and Korea together in US basket. I don't know what the questioners mean for too many eggs, but if he's talking about technology or economic commercial issues, I think it's not that many eggs. But if he's talking about our commitments to the value diplomacy, then probably it's be too many eggs. What I'm saying is, if we are only focusing on solidarity of the like-minded countries alone, and that we are talking about here almost 200 countries around the world, and if we only highlighting the value-based like-minded countries, I think we can only go with 1/5 maximum of the 1/5 of the or one countries going alone. right? So therefore, how we can expand our communications and persuasions and engagement with so-called unlike-minded countries or swing state or middle ground state is very important. Therefore, we, Korea and Japan, have to think about how we can engage with those countries by putting little more eggs in that American value-based basket rather than others. But of course, for technology and economy and even military things, we have to be also prepared for the Biden's value diplomacy versus the Trump's transactional diplomacy. I think although the Biden's value diplomacy is a little bit more stabilized than predicted from our perspectives, but still there are also several risks and several the preparation we have to make. And on the other hand, we really have to think about what we can do with ABC when Trump comes back with transactional diplomacy, because there we have to put really too many eggs, that in this case the financing, right, in the American basket.
You know, Edward, if I could just add one more point, there's a very close colleague of mine, Professor Maiko Ichihara at Hitotsubashi University, and she has done some really good work on Chinese influence operations in Japan, in the Japanese media in particular. So she basically has said that the Chinese have used a lot of internet and other types of trolls to heighten anti-Korean sentiment within Japanese media. And that's one way that China has used this media operations to heighten tensions. And so I think work like that really shows you why we have to be really, really concerned about China's information warfare and operations. And the same thing goes with Russia. So that's one thing that I would like to really emphasize to our listeners and our viewers. And my last point that Shin mentioned, we're all democracies, but sometimes in the past, Korea was what I would argue was a half-baked democracy, because they did not speak out against North Korea's terrible human rights violations. I don't think that our policy towards Pyongyang must always emphasize human rights, but if you criticize human rights violations within South Korea, as the progressives always do, but they have said nothing about the brutal crackdown of human rights in North Korea. So how can you say that you have a value, I guess, strengthening freedom, democracy, etc., when you don't speak out on North Korea? And so I think the key issue here is, if the world doesn't remember the North Korean citizens, we are, I think, in South Korea, we have a duty to remember the North Koreans who are suffering under the reign of Kim Jong Un. And that's why President Yoon nominated Shinhwa as our ambassador for human rights, which we did not have for the past 5 years.
So
I'm glad, Professor Lee, thank you for your wonderful addition, because it's very important part. As I mentioned, if we can just highlighting only for military nuclear issues and also try to ameliorating inter-Korean relationships or the US relation with North Korea, that only spoiled and emboldened the Kim Jong Un, because as I said, his priorities are his own regime security. For that, externally he want to build up military capability. On the other hand, internally he tried to control his population. By the way, Professor Lee, what is the name of the author you mentioned for Information War?
Her name is Professor Ichihara Maiko, or Maiko Ichihara. She is at Hitotsubashi University. I will make sure that I send an email after this, Professor Lee, so that I can connect you too. She is really, really great. I think she is one of the most brightest people working in this subject, which not many Koreans know about. And this is something that I think you should actually be the person who can collaborate with Professor Maiko Ichihara.
Some excellent points raised there. I mean, we now have a question perhaps looking at broader security issues. We have one question from Helen Suck. She asks, what would be the background on the recent decision of AUKUS to include Japan as the first partner under Pillar 2? And what would be the prospect of South Korea with respect to AUKUS's expansion?
Well, you know, I'm sure Professor Ken has something to say to this, but the Australian Prime Minister just said that Japan should not be a member of AUKUS in Pillar 1, but should remain as a partner in Pillar 2. The UK Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee published a report that said South Korea and Japan should join AUKUS as Pillar 2, but not Pillar 1. So that's where the status remains now.
Well, I just concur with Ambassador Lee. You know, we shouldn't dramatize this AUKUS stuff because, you know, it was a sort of compromise between sort of, you know, pro-inclusion figure like Campbell and the UK Australian government. And it doesn't really spell out anything concrete except the parlance of consultation, collaboration, cooperation. In the fields of innovation, data, infrastructure, and so on. So, you know, we have to wait and see because it's not really specific and concrete.
Ambassador
Well,
Lee.
just very briefly, I think tomorrow the Biden and Kishida's summit meeting, I'm sure that they are talking about high-tech cooperation at least, right? And then if you like making a surprising announcement for Japanese joining in AUKUS, and I think there will be a pretty shocks to not only Korea but Canada and others, because I think it's already last week Canada approached to South Korea to discuss some possibility about how we can do something. Those things happen and we are left out. So hopefully it's not some kind of chicken game or just a competition alone, but how we can build up, not necessarily, you know, all of us are joining in AUKUS, but how we can harmoniously and also more constructively making a military cooperation or consultations to address all the challenges facing us.
You know, Edward, the Japanese are working on 6th generation aircraft. We'll see how far that goes, but their partners are Italy and the UK.
Yeah.
And so as an advanced technology power, Japan can choose its partners worldwide. It doesn't always have to be Australia. But I think your audience also should know that the Japanese have very close defense ties with Australia. The South Koreans have very strong defense ties with Australia. So regardless of whether we are in AUKUS or not, and it's a terrible acronym, I think the Japanese and Koreans and the Australians will get by just fine.
I mean, it's some very interesting points, particularly in terms of collaboration, but also in terms of dealing with regional threats. And obviously, one big issue that all of you mentioned earlier is Taiwan. And we have a couple of questions from our audience on Taiwan. The first from Dr. Samir Puri. There is growing talk of what Japan might contribute in a hypothetical Taiwan contingency. Is there a parallel discussion on what South Korea's position might be if there were a severe security situation around Taiwan? And linked to that is a question by Ra Mason. How might the Taiwan issue affect US-ROK-Japan relations? Are we likely to see a de facto alliance between Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea? Professor Endo, you are ready to contribute.
You know, before having a full-fledged response from two Korean colleagues, I just briefly about Japan's contribution. I think Japan cannot solely make any military operations for Taiwan simply because of our constitutional constraints, but the legal framework would allow us to help United States in case of Taiwan contingency. That would inevitably involve Japan in that conflict. So that is how the contribution would take place. The second, we have a basis of U.S. armies in Japan, just like South Korea. And especially, amongst the air forces, the cooperation would be sort of spontaneous and quite instant. And I'd reckon that the South Korea would have to be involved to some extent in some form, maybe for some surveillance or something. Not directly involved in the Taiwan contingency, but some sort of involvement. So that is why I just mentioned about the Taiwan contingency in my initial talk, because this is a sensitive issue, so we shouldn't do it openly, perhaps. But amongst the civil think tank type of cooperation may have to start now. Thank you.
Professor Endo makes a really critical point. If you look at the map, Edward, as you know, the furthest island from Japan's mainland after Okinawa is only about 80 kilometers from Taiwan. So by virtue of geographic proximity, Japan will be involved much more directly in a Taiwan contingency than the ROK. And I think the debate in Japan vis-a-vis Taiwan or a Taiwan crisis has been really ramped up, whereas in South Korea, it really has not registered. And the reason is very simple. Both conservatives and progressives in South Korea do not believe that South Korea should be directly involved in a Taiwan contingency. But as Professor Endo just said, if China invades Taiwan or there is a major military conflict and the ROK does nothing, I think that would have a severely negative impact on our ties with the Americans. So we have to really think about indirect but very firm ways, such as intelligence or ISR capabilities or non-lethal assistance to the Taiwanese, and to make sure that the sea lanes of operation are open. In other words, the Japanese and Koreans import 100% of our oil from the Middle East. So if the Malacca Strait is blocked, then you can forget the Japanese and Korean economy. And so this is why it is crucial for the South Korean Navy, in my own personal view, to be much more alert to what's happening in that region, including a Taiwan crisis.
Well, briefly, I would like you to remind President Yoon last year has taken a stance against the coercive change in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. And that has directly provoked the backlash and criticism from China. But I think if thing happens, as maybe like Professor Lee Jung-min has said, subtle and indirect support has to be given there. But anyway, I think our entrapment or our engagement to some extent may become unavoidable. So, and I had an opportunity to participate in some couple of seminar over the past couple of weeks. There are some voice coming up say Taiwan contingency is the contingency of the Korean Peninsula. I think we have to be ready to accept that scenario because we cannot only ask our allies to help us if things happen to us. In that case, I think how we can delicately make a balance between entrapment and unnecessary participation in the conflict, which will making up bigger backlash from the Korean public, both conservative and progressive.
There's some very important points raised, particularly in terms of the domestic political debates. We're almost, unfortunately, out of time. So I'd just like to raise a couple of issues brought up by our audience, which hopefully our speakers can incorporate in their final remarks. The first from Shun Hokazono is to do with the legacy of the historical recognition issue between Japan and South Korea. Is this going to affect security cooperation? And the second is from Bokyeon Chang, is to do with Japan and Article 9. If Japan tried to dismantle Article 9, how does the trilateral relationship change? So if each of our speakers could perhaps give 1.5 minutes of very brief sort of concluding remarks, perhaps touching on some of these issues. And if we start perhaps with Ambassador Shinhwa Lee, and then go to Dr. Lee, and then Professor Endo in reverse order, that would be excellent. So Ambassador Lee, over to you.
All right. Well, since the two gentlemen can talk about your question, I really want to say one thing, if I can use my 1.5 minutes. You know, at the end of last year, Kim Jong Un declared the two-state system of the Korean Peninsula. I think that signified the fundamental shift in North Korea's approach to South Korean unification. This change, often perceived as a result of course, North Korea's confidence as a nuclear power, but I think it most probably comes from a fear of being observed by South Korea and a loss of confidence in inter-Korean relationships. Whatever it is, I think for North Korea, opting for a two-state system instead of a unification might seem a very practical and rational choice for them, particularly as the possibility of being observed by South Korea increases over time. But I think that will be disastrous for us in both militarily and human rights perspectives. Because the basic agreement between North and South Korea, which doesn't recognize the two as a separate state, essentially views each as a local government with extensive autonomy. That implies that if North Korea loses its autonomous capability, South Korea could potentially assume the direct governance. That's why when we went to the UN, joint UN admission as a separate entity, we had a mutual non-recognition. So we were still one state. It provides South Korea with a unique basis to intervene and stabilizing North Korea if thing happens in North Korea, justifying such intervention without international dispute. But if we are two states, I don't think we can go there, and we cannot protect the 25 million North Korean fellows. Therefore, I think we, South Korea, no matter what North Korea is trying to say, South Korea must not acknowledge North Korea as a state, nor amend the territorial clause in our Article 3 of the Constitution, Article 3, to meet North Korea's demand. Because I think for that, I think West Germany's lesson should be remembered, because the East Germany keep talking about two states since 1960s, and they making an independent constitution for that, but West Germany steadfastly refused that. To recognize East Germany as a separate state and resist transitioning to a two-state system. So I think this stance is very crucial for Korea, and for that, I think US and Japan can help us to continue to having this policy, no matter what regime, what leadership change or regime comes into the power in the South Korea. I think this is very important to protect the human rights of North Korea and the potential for unification.
Thank you,
Edward, in closing, let me just briefly say that, of course, history is always in the background in Korean-Japanese ties. Well, that's not news. This is something that we have been living with for the past, several thousand years. It's not as if we don't have historical disputes with China. In fact, we have huge historical disputes with China. It seems that China has disputes with everybody around its 18 neighbors. But the key question is, how do you manage history? Because you have very, very large issues to cope with. Mm-hmm. We are now entering an era in humanity whereby AI-produced power will be greater than human-manufactured power. So for the first time in human history, mankind has to coexist with AI. And I think the big mistake that China, Russia, and North Korea is making is that they believe that they can control AI. I believe that no government can, including the three of us. But at least in open and free societies, there is a possibility where you are able to create some type of a new social contract and social cohesion whereby we can cope and live with AI to the betterment of mankind. And so that, I think, is much, much more important for our own security than talking about historical issues. I don't want to denigrate history. History is quite crucial for Koreans and Japanese and Chinese. But let us remember that there are enormous agendas over the horizon that will impact our lives, such as the sharpest drop in population is in Japan and South Korea. South Korea and the Japanese will be the most super-aged society in the world in 20 years. That in and of itself should be a huge alarm bell for cooperating between Japan and Korea rather than always grappling about history.
Professor Endo, you have the final word.
Right, thank you. The Japan-Korea bilateral relationship is always difficult. Any small issue turn into a hot potato. And we all are concerned about the changeover of governments, which might undermine the current good relationship. Now, I think we could enhance the functional cooperation. I think there are a number of rooms for that, like a common lane for entry, between the two countries. We can turn this issue of treated water into a sort of common standards, about the nuclear waste or whatever. And beyond that, we should have some sort of common goal. I think Professor Shin-Fa Lee mentioned about the 60th anniversary of our bilateral, relationship, and then we should have some sort of common goal. Now, lastly, about the historical issues, I think Japan, personally, in my personal view, is that Japan should move, to do something symbolic, in some sort of humanitarian acts, like returning of, civil men's remains in Japan, that we haven't done it since 2010. Why can we not do this sort of humanitarian stuff? Simply because, in Korea, there's still a magma for this sort of resentment, and any changeover of government may just open up. And there are some criticisms against President Yoon that he failed to secure anything rewards for his compromises and so on. I think Japan should move to do something symbolic to smooth this bilateral relationship for the future.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much, Professor Endo, for those closing remarks. And we may have to end on a fairly pessimistic but realistic note. And it highlights perhaps just the sheer complexity of the issues at hand. And as all of our speakers have highlighted, the number of variables involved. So all that remains for me to do is to thank our three distinguished guests for sharing their fruitful insights on the situation. Professor Ken Endo, Dr. Chungmin Lee, and Ambassador Shin-Fa Lee. We've learned a great deal today. Thank you, the audience, for joining us and for your questions. We may not have got to all of them, but I hope we've managed to address many of the wide range of issues raised. And we very much look forward to continuing this discussion in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.